Awesome. Thanks, Grace. While people are sharing the best things they've eaten this week, should be interesting. Um, I thought maybe, despite the awe-inspiring bios that Grace let off, Mike, maybe we can share something more about us rather than what we do. What do you think?
Absolutely, let's do that. So I'll kick it off. Should note that I born and raised in Montrealer, son of Italian immigrants. Parents grew up speaking Italian at home and embracing all of the traditions. So pumpkin gnocchi with sage butter that Grace had this week, definitely something that would be made in my house growing up, probably at least once a month or something like that. Very much a builder profile. So while Warren, one of the reasons why we work so well together is Warren is very much about operationalizing and scale and thinking through the big picture strategy. I am obsessed with building technology that I want to use and that I get to share with other people around the world. And you'll hear that come through quite a bit as we go through the discussion today.
Yeah, no, and I think another reason we get along great is you call yourself a builder. I prefer the term maker, and I think it's because I like it when you make sausage and homemade pizza. Those also keep our partnership healthy and strong. No, I think Mike's right. Myself personally, also Montrealer, a little bit more native on the my father's side. I'm a third generation Canadian. I think everyone's ultimately an immigrant at some point. So third generation Canadian, but on my mother's side, I am first generation. My mother came here from Eastern Europe just after World War II. So let's move into I think really lessons we've learned, Mike. Right? We spent a little bit of time chatting before this, and we came down to I think roughly four big lessons that we wanted to focus on that were meaningful for us. And so I think it's less about us teaching, as maybe Grace said, as rather just sharing. And maybe a good place to start though is context of what Smooch was and how we started that is probably relevant context for the lessons. So let me start off there. We're talking, in the early sort of 2010 period, 2010 to 2015, I was CEO of a company called RadioPoint. And that was a business that at its peak was running at about $60 million in ARR and very cash flow positive, but it had turned into a slow growth company. So it was very, generating great cash flow, but the growth wasn't there. And we were sort of tech oriented and really wanted to focus on hyper growth. And so, I kicked off a couple of initiatives internally to kick off sort of innovation within the company and literally trying to breed a startup and trying to think, yes, aligned with what we were doing as a business, also not trying to have any constraints. Part of that, I had called Mike, who had been an early employee of ours and of mine, worked directly with him on sort of our business operations team when I was leading corporate strategy, and asked him if he'd be willing to come back. He had done a startup, he had sold a startup, and I think was sort of in the middle of planning something new. And I said, why don't you come and start this internal startup? And I really kicked it off with the following problem statement: as we were in the customer support business. And I basically asked the question is like, what does mobile mean to customer support? Because we were entirely desktop oriented. So maybe Mike, I'll let you pick up on the story from there.
Yeah, I remember when I first came into the company, there was a team that had been spending a bunch of time thinking about support, meaning support of the mobile device. There was a lot of work with our customers at the time, being primarily telecommunication companies that were also selling mobile phones, to think about how can they build and distribute apps that would be core to solving problems with the device itself. Very much informed by a lot of success that RadioPoint had supporting PC users and all of the problems that could happen with a PC over their life cycle. One of the first things I did was really start talking to customers, not customers that were all of the people paying the bills, the telcos that we're working with, but folks that could be customers aspirational, people that were touching mobile in some way. And we very quickly found that app developers looked like an interesting group to focus in on. Again, this is, call it, late 2013, early 2014 timeframe. The app economy was at a state where it was, I would say, starting to mature. Folks were still very much focused on things like session time, on engagement with their apps. It was these were coming up as core metrics that many of these companies had to present to investors when they were fundraising to prove that they had some kind of product market fit. And one of the early things that we realized is that when things went wrong with one of these mobile apps, businesses that were building them often had to get the customer out of the app experience and over to a website or to an email for support. And it just brought a really disjointed experience. They would screw up engagement metrics. It would be hard to get somebody back into the app to have a conversation, hard to regain that session once it was lost, and often lead to an uninstall. So we really started honing into, okay, well, if the buyer isn't someone that is doing support of the mobile device, but a support of a mobile app, what does that problem solution look like? And that.
I like what you like in retrospect. It was, we were reaching a peak. I'm not even sure that we recognized that at the time in those early days, in that sort of 2013 2014. I think we were right on the cusp of a technological sort of shift in how what was dominant on mobile. But I like that indexing to when we started. Like, I remember us saying, if live chat is this new thing in support, or relatively new thing, is taking over email and taking over phone on the web, like, what does that mean in an app? Because if apps are the new websites, I remember that conversation of trying to think about that technological shift. But ultimately, to sort of accelerate down the path, we ended up seeing a different transformation, technology transformation being driven on mobile, where apps had truly led their peak, and we sort of introduced almost like this new type of OS on the phone, which today we call messaging, right? Where does memory fit in as to where when apps, and that sort of shifted our strategy away of just thinking about in-app to this broader use case of messaging.
It was super iterative, and many of you have built or are building early stage products where you've probably experienced the same thing firsthand. When we built our first version of a call it MVP to start exploring the problems for these app developers, we started with a place that was easy for us to build, and that was on content, on surfacing knowledge about FAQs or other kind of help content to the customer right within the app. Because that was really the easiest place to get started and the most obvious place that app developers were kicking customers over to a website. Now, we knew that knowledge would only get you so far, and that not everybody has documented every problem, or not everybody can self-serve. And when we got there, we started to think, well, how should the communication actually happen? Messaging became the answer because we saw it being used elsewhere on the device. We were looking at the early days of WeChat also at the time, and seeing how engaging of a platform it could be. And that's when we really started to think about the concept of messaging as the only experience. Instead of it just being an add-on or a bolt-on, how could we position ourselves to take a bet that messaging would in some ways replace the OS, or be the place where most people would spend their time? And how would we reimagine the app economy into a messaging economy? It really was taking that step of looking, okay, well, what's the next problem that led us to this?
Yeah, and I remember we were never sort of purists. I don't think that's our personalities to think like, oh, messaging is going to take over the world and it's going to be the only way that brands and businesses communicate. But we did have conviction that on the mobile phone, how we move from websites to apps seemed a little bit simplistic, right? Like, I remember us looking at like Amazon website, Amazon store on a phone, and saying like, okay, we shrunk it, we made it a little bit more mobile friendly, but the experience of sort of taps and filling in forms wasn't really, there was no adaption there to this new medium. And I think that's what excited us, is we really believe that the conversational interface of a phone could radically transform how businesses interact, to the point that, and because a lot of these messaging platforms were platforms that you could run executable code in them, they could be like deliver any web service, that we said, hey, what if like you can just have this conversational experience with a brand, ask for what you want, make payments, and we delivered a Stripe integration super early.
And I think, this makes me think of a conversation I had early on with Hamnet, one of our other co-founders who's not on this call. I was trying to get him excited about the idea of what Smooch would be. And the way that I framed messaging to him wasn't, like you said, wasn't in a purist way that messaging will dominate and will come to replace everything. It was exactly in that transformation that had occurred between websites and apps. On both of these mediums, our whole purpose from a design point of view became about creating these walled gardens and these captive experiences to hold people into a very branded, very stylistic way to suck their time. I don't say that in a nefarious way, but the whole goal was to bring somebody into this experience, curate it, and lock them into it. Whereas the concept of mobile in general doesn't really lend itself to that, right? Mobile phones are something that are in our hands, but stuff is going around us all the time when we're using them. We're changing location, we're changing context continuously. What was most exciting to us, and I think what got Hamnet excited back in the day, was the reason why this shift mattered is it was a chance for all of us builders and app developers and businesses to reimagine our experiences, not as these captive like hooking moments, but instead as micro experiences that were delivered when they were relevant and got out of your way afterwards. And I think we've seen in the past few years a number of businesses that have shifted and adapted how they use mobile to think about this kind of experience rather than the captive app.
Right. Yeah. So why don't we do this? Let's shift gears and get into sort of more of the contextual lessons we learned along the way, to sort of, to make sure people understand our full story. We ended up, the business was started. It's an interesting, background piece, but the business was started inside this other company where we both were, called Radio Point. We sold Radio Point at the end of 2015, and as part of that process, we spun out what became Smooch, this messaging technology business, a messaging platform to connect brands and their consumers over any messaging channel. So we spun that out in 2015, and we basically ended up selling the business in early 2019 to Zendesk. Zendesk was an early customer of ours. We were powering some of their internal messaging. And we won't get into all the details of why we chose to sell, but suffice to say, it was a good opportunity for us as founders. That's always a realistic point or an important point. But the other part is, we believe that fulfilling the mission and really getting messaging into the hands of more businesses was something we could accelerate like dramatically with Zendesk. And for any of you interested, just go look at Zendesk What's New. Today it's on their homepage, zendesk.com, What's New, and read that, and you'll see a ton about messaging, right? And I think it's fun that we're able to see our technology, the product we built, creating the foundation for essentially every single customer engagement product within the Zendesk portfolio. So that tells you just a little bit of how we got to where we are. So the reality is, that's a nice story, sounds easy, so to speak, but it's tough, right? Startups are defined by having messy and hard problems. And, I think Mike and I have always believed lateral thinking and creativity are essential to solving previously unsolved problems. Like, it's this, people always talk about the idea they get in the shower type of thing, right? It is really about, like, how do you spur that creativity? And I think one of the things we've taken away that we want to talk about first is creating an environment of intellectual safety. I don't think we can understate this, of having a no bad ideas culture. And so that's the first thing to talk about. Mike, how do you want to take a stab at this?
I can talk about it in terms of something we did early on to build up a culture which has become to be known as a blameless culture. in this regard. One of the things that we did, myself being an engineer by training and a maker, like we said at the beginning, this became really natural to myself and our early team, which is pretty much exclusively technical and thought this way as well. The idea was to try to whenever we would get hit by some problem in the road, and there were a number of them that came up even in the earliest days, we never tried to attribute blame to any one individual. The questions, the investigations, the language we used were all there to help us find what was wrong with the system. How did we end up in this way? And this would happen on, call it, a bi-weekly basis as we shipped new builds into production and did a retrospective over what went wrong and what went bad. It would come down to moments along our early funding path. It would come down to how we were interacting with our customers and what some of those relationships would look like. And we're always trying to look at things at a system level without signaling out, to any one person that, it was a personal mistake that got us there. The other thing that we did is, as we were growing the team initially, we made sure that the folks that we would bring on reflected this value and this approach to solving problems. We would test people in the interview process by specifically calling out issues with work that they've done. Even if it was correct, we challenged the correctness of it as if we didn't understand and didn't believe, because we wanted to look for evidence that the person was able to stand back, take a look at what was on the whiteboard, take a look at what they just said, and reflect on it, and then have the confidence to either stand up and defend it appropriately, or the humility to be able to break down and find another solution. I feel that without creating this space where people can judge the work without feeling it a judgment on themselves, it's hard to really get to a place where you have the safety to be able to operate. Maybe Warren, I think also one of the things that I touched on here was that it's okay to be wrong. What do you think about the fact that we're in this environment which supposedly celebrates failures, right? You hear about this all the time, but sometimes that seems scary or hard to understand. How do you think about this?
Yeah, I think about it in such an old school fundamental way. And I just literally had a conversation with my 14-year-old daughter about this, called the scientific method, right? Like, we all learned this literally in high school. Have a hypothesis, test the hypothesis. It doesn't matter whether your hypothesis was right or wrong, because by having an assumption, by having this thesis that you can then go out and test, get feedback on, whether you're right or wrong, you've still learned something and then can create another test, right? And this to me is what the startup iteration is all about. And this is how I think about failing is okay, right? To me, it's not about celebrating failure. Some people call it fail fast, right? Which is sort of this focus on experiment quickly, right? So you learn quickly. Some people call it fail gracefully, which you mean you learn. I don't think anybody really means that they want to fail. It's the point that failure is just a natural part of learning. But behind that, back to again this blameless culture of you want to test out ideas that have never been tested out before. That's the challenge. I think the notion of the scientific method in testing is much easier than coming up with a hypothesis, an idea that nobody has ever had before, that perhaps nobody has ever tested. And that's where the culture really comes in here, right? That's the most powerful point, is how do you make sure you get everybody's point of view on the table, and how do you get them comfortable doing that? And then you have a culture which is super open about incorporating all that feedback and sort of making the best next step decision, right? It's not the answer, it's the next step decision. So if you feel good about that, maybe we want to do a quick poll. Right, so what we've done is, I think Grace in the background is going to put up a poll here, 2 different questions, phrased similarly. So I'll have her put that up. I'll talk at the same time, right? Is the first one here is, how do you believe a startup should operate, right? So we put down 3 things here, right? That founders strongly opinionated on a vision, and they basically make the vast majority of decisions. founders should lead with strong opinions, right? They got a point of view, a hypothesis, but inspire their teams to challenge, debate, and then and adapt. And the last one is founders really focusing on the problems to be solved, and letting the organization create solutions. So all three, the two questions are framed in the same way. The second one is, how do you think the most successful startups actually operate, right? So what do you believe in personally? And don't try not to corrupt yourselves here. What do you believe? And then what do you think the reality is if you think about the most successful, tech companies, in the world? If you think about current generation, think about an Airbnb, obviously. Think about a Facebook. You can think about a Google. You can think about an Amazon. I was thinking about Airbnb because of their IPO, but we'll give people a little bit of time to answer here. We've got about 9 of 23. So get your votes in. More inputs, the better. Always good to see what the whole room thinks. Okay, I think we're going to move forward with this. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to. Okay, I think we're sharing the results now. Everybody sees that, I think. Okay, so on the first question, a really heavy majority picked the middle ground here. And I think for me, this resonates. But I'm always personally trying to push myself to number 3, right? I'm always trying to keep myself personally in the camp of focusing on the problem and letting the team lead with the solution. But it's really tough. Like, usually you have a strong point of view. So I'll comment on the second one here, and then I'll let Mike chime in. I think the relatively equal split here makes a lot of sense. I think the real answer here is there's no one formula. I think it comes up to the personality of founders. You think about an Apple of a Steve Jobs character. Like, I'm happy to say, like, I have no Steve Jobs character, right? Like, I think there's very few leaders in the world who are, but I think you would classify Steve Jobs as this, top kind of founder here, right? Very opinionated on vision and strategy, and ultimately sticks to it, and guides a lot of the key decisions. So there's leaders across the spectrum, and I really like how people's answers were different across the two. Any reactions on your side, Mike?
Yeah, I think that when I think about the concept of a strong founder that drives all decisions, and our perception that successful startups might have that as a common characteristic, at least by the second part of the poll. I wonder how much of that is a false perception. Even in the job case, it was a great story I read earlier this week about Apple employees at the time of Jobs supposedly had an annual cash prize for the employee that they thought was most likely, or who was best at standing up to Steve Jobs or gotten the most fights with him in a given year. And Jobs celebrated that, didn't actually reject it. Feel that there's a, doing the event, having the public persona of a company as a founder, you get associated with that company very, very tightly. And I think there's a lot of hidden and silent influence that goes by the wayside. And even founders that are very headstrong, as I've seen, with some experience working with other founders, has showed me that there's often a network of people around them that are managing them, whispering in their ears and guiding them to, a decision that looks like their own, but is really come at with more of the organization behind them. So I guess I believe less and less in what I think is the myth of the strong and correct founder as time goes on, particularly in the cases of success.
Yep, super interesting. So I think there's a good bleed in from this poll to the next lesson that we wanted to share, which stems from this, no matter what, a founder has to start with that problem statement, right? Rather than the solution or the what we're going to build. And that ties into the why behind a business. You know, you before product market fit, after product market fit, you make dozens and dozens of product decisions, go to market decisions, business decisions. Every day you're making these decisions. And it's great to have this culture of intellectual honesty, and getting every voice on the table, testing the best ideas, taking that feedback and iterating. But you need guardrails here, right? And filters, right? And so what we've talked about is this necessity of starting with the why, right? And just being intentional, with everything you do, right? And some companies call this purpose, some companies call it mission. And I think a little bit of what we learned here is, this purpose is core not only to decision making, and keeping yourself grounded in what you're supposed to be doing, sort of the forest for the trees metaphor, making sure that you're sort of chopping down the right trees. But it's also about employee motivation, right? Employees do, it's so real, like, want to be connected to the business, not in this, for me, not connected in sort of like only an emotional way, but connected to understanding what you're actually trying to do and being able to connect what you're doing to that bigger outcome of the business, right? Every business in the world is going to have salespeople that can describe their job in the same way. But the question is, like, the so what? Like, what happens when customers buy your product? So I'll pause there, Mike. Maybe you can talk about, a time where you think we got this really right, or really wrong. Either whichever case you're happier to discuss.
Okay, I'll talk about when we got it wrong, because that's really close to the earliest days of when we're building. And then I'll flip it to you on the right side of it, because I think I know what you'll say. On the wrong side, I mentioned that we started with our first MVP being around delivery of content and knowledge to customers or to end users who would be having a problem with a mobile app and wanted to read about the solution directly within the app itself. Now, app developers like this, we saw early success getting it integrated into a number of apps. And when we work with those customers through a lot of one-on-one interviews, we were talking to developers. Developers were like us, we understood them, we got on the phone with them, and we got on the subjects of crashes, of problems that you would have on the technical basis with the application. And part of the reason why we got into that subject is we weren't really talking to the people who were thinking big picture about the success of these apps. We were really there with the makers just like us. And this led us down the path of thinking about mobile diagnostics and crash reporting and log collection, all of which are really important features that a number of companies have built successful businesses around. But it wasn't core to our mission and what we were there to do. Remember, we were there to try and solve the user experience problems that could happen with an application when it went down. We're trying to solve fundamental business problems, and this really wasn't connected to things like logging and crash reporting. So while we end up spending maybe about 3 months of our small team's time building out these capabilities, we ended up ripping it out because we realized it wasn't consistent with our purpose and what we were trying to build as a company. And it's interesting, we ripped it out when it was still in beta, but people were using it and nobody really cared. It didn't affect any of the broader conversations we were having. So, lesson learned there on making sure that purpose is something that we maintain.
And how do you remember how the team reacted to that? Was that a tough decision on the team, or were people able to rally behind it?
The way that we presented it was really careful. So the discussion and the communication was less about killing the feature and more about focusing on our true path and our opportunity. Like, everybody could walk down the logic ladder of saying why we needed to put all of our eggs in this one basket. We were this young team fighting for product market fit, and getting folks excited about what we can be versus focusing on what we are was really the key to getting this done without too much of a revolt.
Nice. Yep. Yeah, and so you were You're
Where
asking
did we
me
get
to,
this right, Warren? Like, can you think of a time where the starting with why really
yeah,
everything
and
was
I
a
know like there's always one that's always very formative to me. But I always sort of remember that I think I remember this wrong. So you're probably going to correct parts of the story, which is fine. But this is the story I tell at least, and I remember telling it to the board, and I remember telling it to the board in this way. So you know we were all about mobile and mobile first, and the first product we launched was an in-app messenger, and like in-app messaging was sort of live chat for mobile apps. Um, and you know that was this like again constant mobile first framework. And then one day I heard that one of the devs or the team had built a web messenger. So this was still within Radio Point. I was CEO. I wasn't like hands-on. Mike and the team were the guys hands-on. I sort of learned about it after the fact, which is great and fine. And they were built a web messenger, and I was like, why the hell are we building a web messenger when we're supposed to be a mobile first business? And the answer ultimately I got was, look, all these mobile first customers of ours who we've won now and are using our mobile app, our SDK inside of their mobile app to deliver messaging, they also have websites, and they do have, before their customers become customers and their prospects, and they might be looking for help on the web, they've had to use a competitive product, like a different live chat or web messaging product. And so this was to support our customers, all of their engagement. So regardless of whether they were mobile first or not, they also had websites. And it was like, great, like we have this clear rationale for why we're building it, even though there could have been an easy answer to say, no, we don't build that because we're mobile first. And the answer was, no. Like we have a mobile first, like our thesis is predicated on the world becoming more mobile and mobile led, but it was never that it's the only channel, and we were committed to solving customer problems. And so it fit really well, and it fit with the narrative. But I remember for a lot of people, including on the board, and this is where the story stems from, said, this is exactly what you guys said you weren't going to do. You're just like everybody else now. So that's my story there. I don't know if that remotely resembles reality.
pretty close to it?
Pretty close enough?
Yeah, maybe we can move on to the poll.
Yeah, great. So what we're going to do here is, so we're just trying to keep you guys all engaged here with different polls. So here we're thinking about like stating objectives, right? And this is through the lens of knowing the why. So two different cases here. You know, one is a product objective. One is much more of sort of a revenue objective. Go through it. Which one do you think is best? This should be a little bit easier and quicker to answer than the last. All right, we got about a third of you in so far. Let's see if we can get it up to 60%. And when we talk about this again, you're going to hear some biases in terms of like even what the word objective means, right? So lots of these things are nuanced. So we'll talk about that. All right, give it 5 more seconds. Get in your last votes. There we go. Okay, so on the first one, we were sort of almost evenly split between the second two. And ultimately, for me, as an objective, the what you're trying to accomplish, I would go long on the third one here. And the idea is that the other one, this launch and the usage, the adoption, those are really important, but I think about those as measures, right? These are assumptions that if we've done this, then we're going to achieve the objective, right? But really, why do we even want to launch this integration with Zendesk, right? We don't even know what we're talking about here, but it's some product integration with Zendesk. Why do we want to do it? The why behind it, you got to like sometimes ask why many times, right? And so here what we're saying is the ultimate why is about improving retention. So it has something to do with increasing product value, making it stickier. That's the reason for the integration. And then how do we know we're on a path to success? Right? Some of the early indicators might be adoption and shipping it by a certain date. On the second one, Mike, maybe you want to comment on the second one? Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah, let's keep on moving in the interest of time. I mean, I can't see the results on my end, so it's hard.
Oh,
I don't
got it.
have a list of what was
Oh,
voted in.
shoot. Oh, now they're up. I guess I think I was supposed to do that, but Grace did it. Yeah, but that's fine. The second one's going to be the same answer, more or less, right? Which is biased towards the last one, which is, why do we care about revenue, right? Revenue is never an end goal. Like it's not the purpose behind your company. It's a driver for something else. So in this case, we put in the context of dilution, right? We're trying to increase the value of the business. And we want to raise money at a certain, we want to demonstrate that. And revenue is one way to demonstrate that. But by the way, it's not the only way. Like you could put a patent as a key result here, right? Some crazy patent that could be worth $50 million on its own in terms of valuation, having nothing to do with your ARR. So again, focus on that why, that bigger purpose. Okay. Let's move on so that we can make sure we have time for questions. Mike, you want to lead on this one?
Yeah, sure. This was something that was a key factor in us building and growing Smooch, and then even thinking about how we survive in our new reality, integrated within a much larger organization. And it was one of the things where, for me personally, as a relatively new founder and leader of large teams, that I had to learn quickly on the job. One of the things I realized is that I can't do it all on my own. Just like Warren is known for longer than I have, and he can't do it all on his own. And probably one of the biggest predictors of eventual success of your business is how great of a team you're able to form around yourself, who are believers in your vision, contribute it with their own, and together you come up with something that is greater than any of you can do individually. But it's one thing to recruit somebody and to bring in that reality distortion field, promise them riches, and get them to join your side. For them to really perform, you need to get individuals to feel a strong sense of a very personal accountability for the successful outcomes that can happen, and knowing that they can drive those outcomes and be the solely responsible person who's tackling these really big and hard things that you're undoubtedly going to have to do when you're building a startup. And it's even more complex because, as I mentioned earlier, you're trying to do this within a blameless culture, where if something goes wrong, you're not going to point the finger at that accountable person and fire them. Everyone's here to learn. Everything's an experiment. Things don't go according to plan. So how do you create an environment where people are accountable and will feel a strong sense of purpose around the problems that they've gotten solved, without also bringing in blame? It's a tricky thing to do. One of the things that was really important in getting this done was, as we built out the team, to really be careful and purposeful about who we brought on, and the stories and rituals that we shared to kind of celebrate this accountability and make it a norm within the young company that we're building. One of the first things we did is we tried to hire for backgrounds that were not exactly standard cookie cutter rock star engineers. And there's a bigger question to have here, a discussion to have around DEI, right? And how important it is to have diverse ethnicities and other protected groups, part of a team. But even beyond, traditional DEI, is thinking about finding people that are predominantly curious, even if they don't match the cookie cutter. Some of, I have two really good examples of the early team, one of whom was a developer who was an intern at the time, had no side projects, no presence on GitHub, no interests around technology outside of work, didn't carry a smartphone. Um, Probably the best developer that we've had on the team since then, was this kind of candidate who had been rejected by other recruiters at Radio Point who had met him. And another is a man who was trained as a chef and was self-taught effectively in writing code. But with it came a hunger and an appreciation for the struggle and a curiosity about technology and problems that you wouldn't find in somebody who's modeled their life around, the prototypical engineer at a startup living like a Silicon Valley life. The other thing we did to drive accountability is, early on, the smallest wins were things that we would celebrate. And we would look at it as not this is a big business success, it's going to drive our valuation. Everything was about the craft and artistry of what we were doing. I would say we felt that we were all craftspeople very much. If we got someone like Chris Messina, who, if you don't know him, is the guy who purports to have invented the hashtag, when he looked at our product and gave us kudos, we all took it as a win and celebrated, hey, we got this, rock star in our minds at the time talking about us that way. We had someone, an activist in Nashville, HIV positive activist that was trying to drive support for people with HIV and questions about sexual health, build an app based on our platform and messaging to give anonymous support to people. None of these drove our valuation. None of these had any impact in our core objectives and our metrics that we were chasing, but they were all proof that individuals who had contributed built something that was bigger than we had expected, bigger than themselves. And we really drove this and celebrated this. And it made people rise up to tackle the bigger problems that we'd face. Now, I have a lot of, call it, perspective of being in this like young, hungry team and building it from the ground up. But Warren actually brings a view of leading a team of leaders at Radio Point that were more seasoned, and definitely more seasoned than I was when I was part of it. How did you think about driving things like accountability and goal setting at the stage versus, coming in and joining a younger company as Smooch and bringing less experienced leaders through it?
Yeah, I think it's, I love the themes that you talked about and sort of the bottom up connection sense, like the sort of emotional sense of ownership, and those ties to the business again, and, and celebrating successes along the way that reinforce that. I love that. For me, when I think about more senior teams and management teams, and especially in those days, at the end of the day, leadership delegates, like if we believe in this model of leadership delegating problems, right? Not the solutions, right? Delegating the problems and making sure people own those problems, and then of course have to own the solutions as well. The bigger the organization, the bigger the problems you're delegating, right? The CEO of Alphabet, the CEO of Apple are delegating much bigger chunked problems to their team than downwards in the organization, right? So, that's the first thing. And I think, the bigger the problems you're delegating, the more accountability you need. And it's sort of the less excuses, the less you can tolerate people explaining away, call it failures, right? Those experiments that went wrong or unpredictable things that went wrong. And so something, the tool that I use that I've fallen in love with is ensuring that everybody always answers the following question following a project that wasn't a grand slam, right? So whatever you set out to do, you're gonna have some objectives, you're gonna have some key results. If you didn't blow it out of the park, right? Like if you weren't 1,000% successful, I always want people to ask, what could I have done differently? And this is that sense of accountability, right? So don't talk about the things that were out of your control. Talk about the things that were in your control. And I have a great story. I actually learned this from an employee at Radio Point that honed it for me. He was an IT guy running data centers for our VP of Ops. And this was sort of pre-cloud. We weren't in Amazon yet. It was coming. And he came to me, he asked me to go to lunch. and he sort of wanted to just have this conversation and get feedback. And he said he was convinced that the technology and like the data center technology decisions and operational decisions we were making were wrong, and that he needed to better influence his boss. And I said to him, I don't understand. Like, aren't these decisions yours? Like, you're running this. And he said, yes, but my boss just doesn't agree, and I can't get her on side. I must be doing something wrong in my communication, right? I've got so much conviction. I believe in this. Can you help me go through this logic? Like, what am I miscommunicating here? And I think a lot of other people would have said, like, oh, it's not my fault. Like, my boss overruled me, right? That is the most typical answer. And that is all of our natural reflex is oh, like somebody else did it, right? It wasn't my fault. And so I just loved how this guy framed that. Like, and this is a simple example, but you can think about every single problem in your business, every single challenge. Imagine if 100% of your staff always ask, what could I have done differently? It's incredibly powerful. So I know we're clipping away on time, so maybe we'll skip the next poll. We'll just get into the last lesson and then prep Q&A. I think we can do the last lesson quickly. It's almost the most foundational, which is patience, right? And so through all this, we talked about these 4 other concepts, right? One, which was the last one, accountability and everyone being an owner. We talked about starting with why and having this clear purpose. We talked about intellectual safety. But the last point is patience. And I'll ask Mike to talk about the early days in the environment, both within Radio Point and outside, that contributed to this. But solving these problems fundamentally takes time, right? We always look at, and a lot of people assume there's these overnight successes, and then you dig in and you're like, holy shit, this was not overnight at all. There was this long, slow treading below the surface where nobody could see you. And then like shortly after you break out, you really break out, and people just can't see that hidden journey. And so I think we had an environment that we reflect on that we'd like to recreate in any future model like this, which is patience. Mike, how do you think about this? What were some of the early elements that allowed for it?
Yeah, there's a couple of places where I'll speak to that made us lucky and made this model work for us. I mentioned earlier that the craft was really important, and we could celebrate this. The craft came in 2 places. Came firstly in what we were building and what it looked like and felt like and how well it worked. But it also came into how focused we were from a product management perspective and how close we were to the customer and what we were really delivering there. Revenue wasn't on our mind at all. It was something that we knew we would have to solve for. If it was up to me and I could build a business where I could give all of this technology away for free, I would have done it, because the revenue wasn't what was driving me at that point. It was really the thrill of building something. And I would say that our early team focused exclusively on this. We weren't company building, we weren't business building. We knew that we'd eventually have to get there, and if we were successful, there'd be all of these spoils of the battles to take on. But it was really driven by curiosity, and that was a privilege. And it was a privilege because we came at this from a funding situation that was a lot easier than other startups. Even once we spun out, we had a core team assembled that we were able to pay decently. Nobody was eating ramen noodles. People were paid appropriately. We had enough funding and patient funders that were on board with our message to them that we would take time to build this and that it wouldn't be an overnight success. We didn't overpromise. I remember when we raised money, talking to 2 venture capital firms and being more honest than I've been in any other pitch in my life, where we were saying, look, there's 2 ways we can grow this business. We're not sure which one it's going to be. We see some evidence of traction in each one. We don't know how sticky it'll be. There's some good signals here, but we just don't know. And it'll take us time to figure it out. There was no showboating. There was none of that typical, bravado that you'd expect to see coming out of, Silicon Valley tech industry. And I think that actually was refreshing for some of our investors. It definitely created an environment where our team was able to not feel pressured by external forces that they felt they had no agency over, that they couldn't control. The pressure that they felt was their own, their own pressure to find product market fit, to make sure that their work was usable and interesting and valuable. Um, and I would say that in general, it allowed us to be really patient with our development, patient when talking with customers, and not cut corners. And it showed up in the quality of the product. Um, but there's definitely, there've been lots of moments where we wanted to quit, lots of moments where because it was going so slow, it was hard to look back and see the progress we were making. Um, Bringing on new employees, particularly new leaders, made this really clear. They'd ask a lot of questions about our business, and we weren't nearly far enough along to attract the talent we wanted. And it was a very difficult place to be in as a founder, and it requires a certain amount of uh, just, I guess, mental toughness to work through and be okay with the fact that it's not going as fast as you'd like it to go. Um, Warren, this makes me think of something. You're talking about slow learning. Um, you were reading about that and thinking about it. Can you maybe talk about how that's relevant to what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I put in here, if anybody has questions, pop them in and we'll pivot, but otherwise we'll keep going for a few more minutes. Yeah, this notion of slow learning, I was reading about it in a book called Range by David Epstein. Definitely recommend it to all of you. But the idea here is, think about a school environment, two different types of teaching style. So one where a teacher is really almost holding people's hands, helping them learn, right? So you ask a question to the room and you make it multiple choice, and you ask one kid and they get it wrong, you get to another one, but ultimately you're feeding the answers, right? You're guiding people so much. And it's not that you're telling them the answers, you feel like you're teaching, but you're really helping them, and you're trying to get them to learn fast. Um, and this is different than a teacher who might put more problems on the students, right? Put them into a test environment that they're not really ready for, and they're going to find the test a lot harder than if they had 3 preview quizzes where the test really looks the same, and they're like, oh, like I've done this before, right? This is easy, and they go and do it. And so there's been a lot of studies that show the latter method is much more effective to learning. And so I think it was the Army. So in this book Range, they talk about this study in depth about the military. I think it was the Air Force Academy or university, where they had 10 simultaneous Cal 1 classes followed by Cal 2, Cal 3, all these different levels of calculus, however many they go. And basically there's an inverse relationship between people's results in Cal 1 and the results in Cal 2 and Cal 3. So basically, the better they did in Cal 1, the worse they did in Cal 2 and 3. And also at the same time is the better they did in Cal 1, the better they rated their teachers and said, oh, this was a great teacher, right? And the lesson they learned was that teachers who were easy on their students, who spoon-fed and really trained them to take the test, weren't doing them a service. The teachers who forced their students and allowed their students to struggle and wrestle with problems, that sort of slow, begrudging learning, right, where you're sort of dragging yourself through the dirt sometimes, is you take those lessons in. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out the book. We got one question that popped in here, which is, what key metrics will indicate product market fit of B2B SaaS? The most traditional people are going to talk about in B2B SaaS is obviously just adoption, right? So, at the most simplest level, they're going to think about ARR. And then depending on your type of, B2B product, whether you're going after SMB or you're going after enterprise, there's going to be very different metrics there of what you have fit on. But beyond ARR, it's going to be your actual product engagement, right? To understand, is this a once a week product use? Is this a daily product use? Is once a month?
Right. At Smooch, we used, to justify this for ourselves, we used how critical we were, how many critical deployments was our technology used in. And we would judge a critical deployment by thinking, has the buyer of our, we were building a communication platform as a service. We're thinking, is the buyer of our technology integrating us in a way which would cause them, quote unquote, material pain if we were to go belly up tomorrow? And we were only assessing that we had found product market fit when we had, in our minds, it was a rather low number because of the complexity of our solution. But when a sufficient number of people had come to depend on our solution and we could measure it, that's when we felt good about saying we'd crossed that threshold, not before. And I think Warren has been probably the biggest challenger of whether or not we are at this threshold. We've had many conversations, getting off planes, really excited about, you know, a deal that we signed where Warren then tempered it. But I think it's important, like, how critical are you to your customers, really? If you could go bankrupt and they wouldn't care and would just fold it up and move on, you weren't that critical, and you probably haven't found it in SaaS.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think, you know, you can, like, whoever asked the question, everyone else, you can go sell your ARR numbers all day long, and I'm not saying that they're not valuable. Big companies have a lot of money sometimes, and so they can write big checks, and then, you know, you're not really an important part of their business, and you end up disappearing. So in our case, actually, ironically, I think our three big customer wins early on were Oracle, Four Seasons, and Zendesk, like big reference names. We had a lot of other small customers, but these were the brands that could tell a story. And ironically, for the way the business, you know, came to an end and being acquired by Zendesk, like, Zendesk was like immaterial. Like, the way they were using us was zero critical. Whereas, like, Oracle, we were at like the center of their AI business. Four Seasons, we were like the center of their most dominant, what became their most dominant communication channel. If we went down, Oracle and Four Seasons were down in a material part of their business that mattered. Zendesk couldn't have cared. And there's a big difference there in the evidence of product market fit.
Awesome, guys. Well, we're at time now, and really appreciate the conversation. Wonderful to hear both of your experiences and how you made it to where you are today. We appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. This session was recorded, so it will be available in the member library, and we hope to see you guys soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Grace. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.